For my 40th birthday, my wife got me the greatest gift of all. She got me a physical. Yeah. Now, being a strong-willed, masculine man, I looked her right in the eyes and I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I went off to the doctor, and I would love to tell you that I had the greatest of attitudes, but you would know better than that. And they did their usual battery of tests, and they poked, prodded, and pretty much offended me in any way that they could find fit to do, and sent me on my way. And about a week later, I was to come back and hear the results of the tests and what had happened and so forth. And I think it's fair to say I had this nicest Pakistani doctor. I mean, he was just the friendliest guy in the world. When he walked in the room, he had a big smile on his face and go, "Hello," and he just loved it and so forth. But when I went back for the visit and he came in the room, he was not smiling. In fact, his face was in the chart, and he had a very concerned look on his face. And as he began to explain to me a little bit about what he saw in the chart, I think, long story short, every number that could be going the wrong direction was going the wrong direction. And he wanted me to know that. And if I was being truthful, it wasn't that big a surprise. I wasn't exercising. I wasn't watching what I was eating. I was just living any way I wanted to. So it wasn't that big a surprise. But it was such a serious moment, I decided to use sarcasm, which I don't use very often. But it might be my love language, but I just decided, as he's talking, I'm like, "Well, Doc, I guess I'm on a diet then." And he didn't laugh. And he goes, "Oh, no, Mr. Jason, you don't need a diet. You need life change." And those words, man, they stuck with me forever. I'll never forget them because I understood what he was saying. You see, a diet oftentimes can be a short-term solution or fix to get to a goal. And he was saying, you don't need a short-term solution here. If you want to stay off medication for as long as possible, unless you wish to live off a pharmacy for the next few years, you have to radically change your life. It's not just a diet you need to be on. You have to relook at the entire thing. You have to look at what you eat. You have to start exercising, and you're going to have to look at how you engage anxiety and stress and all those areas in your life. I didn't need a diet. I had to engage life change. I wonder how many of us have to engage that as well. So as we said, we're continuing our series in re, and we talked last week that re is a prefix that we put on the front of words. Sometimes it means to do again. If you re-look at something, you're looking at it again. To redo something is to do it again. Last week we asked an important question, though. We realized that just as organizations have vision statements, you too can have a personal vision statement as well. And a vision statement answers this question: I exist to blank. Fill in the blank. What is it you exist for? What did God create you for? What's that thing you need to do this year, this season, where you're at to raise the bar and live out the life that God uniquely called you to? What's your vision statement in life? I exist to blank. This week, I want to ask another question. A question that many of us need to engage in our lives. And on the surface, it seems like a simple question, but once we really start engaging it, we realize it's not that simple a question at all. And that question is this: do you want to grow? Do you want to grow? In your life, do you want to change? Do you want to raise the bar? Do you want to get better? It's the same as what the doctor was asking me. Do you just want to continue going the direction you're going, doing the same old things the same old way, expecting different results, which is insanity, right? Or do you want to raise the bar in your life, turn a corner? Do you want to change? How about you? Do you want to change? Are there areas in your life that you need to raise the bar in, that need to be improved, that you need to move past? Do you want to grow? Because one of the maxims we'll learn in life, an important thing we have to remember in life, And it's true in science and nature, but it's true in our lives as well. Anything that stops growing dies. Anything that stops growing dies. And what that means is rule of nature, rule of life. You are either growing or you are dying. Which is it when you look at your life? Are you growing? Are you dying? Are you raising the bar? What areas in your life need life change? Jesus would ask a man a similar question to this back in the first century. It's going to be in the book of John. John was a man who followed Jesus. He was a disciple in the first century, and he wrote about his time with Jesus. And we would hear about one of those stories today in John chapter 5. Starting in verse 1, it says this. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who'd been there had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" Interesting question. Do you want to get well? And what we'll learn from this story is that this man indeed did want to get well, but he had been trying for years to try to do things on his own, and he couldn't get it accomplished. And what he found out is the people that were around him, they weren't helping him get well either. They weren't helping him move towards healing either. And so there's a very important lesson we have to learn in this story, and one that you have to engage as well too if you're going to ask this question: do I want to grow? Do I want to get better? And that realization we have to get our arms around is our first fill in, or second actually at this point, and that's this: real life change requires Jesus. Real life change requires Jesus. I don't know how people engage change and problems. I don't know how they confront the areas of their life they need to in life, but they do it alone. And every time I see somebody trying to engage life change and they don't include Jesus and they try to do it on their own, it just seems to make it worse. And it doesn't matter what area they're going in. I mean, whether that's walking through an addiction or maybe a hard time in life, like a divorce, or maybe they're engaging sexual identity or a sexual sin that's in their life. There's many things that we have to engage in life, but we have to resolve in our heart: do you want to grow? Do you want to change? But like I said, so many of us try to do this on our own. I'll just fix myself. I don't need any help. I can fix this. But yet I watch as people over and over again dive into these pools of destruction, and then they end up hurting the people around them. They only make their situation worse. They just seem to go back and back to those old habits, those old ways. They never break through. There's never victory. The Bible has a verse to describe what this process looks like sometimes. It's in Proverbs 26, and it says this: "As a dog returns to vomit, so fools repeat their folly." As a dog returns to vomit, so fools repeat their folly. And maybe you're saying, "Jason, that's disgusting. I mean, that is terrible. Why would you even bring that up?" But I think the writers very clearly wanted you to know that when we keep going back to our bad habits, when we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, when we keep diving into those pools of death and destruction, it looks like a dog going back to its vomit. There's no way to paint a pretty picture. We just keep getting in these cycles and we can't get out of it. We keep trying to change ourselves when real life change requires Jesus. It requires Jesus. How many of you out there are trying to raise the bar, to change? And you're shaking your fist in the air and say, "If you want to do it, I got to do it." And I want to challenge you. If you want to experience real life change, if you want to raise the bar in your life, if you want to go to the next level, it requires Jesus. You've got to get Jesus inside of you. And I can't always explain how that works. There's just something about getting Jesus inside of you and having a relationship with Jesus that he can rip apart and tear apart all that junk, that debris, and that destruction, and he can replace it with a heart that beats like his heart beats, and he can take your life and turn it around, and you can look more and more like Jesus in all that you do, but you got to get Jesus inside of you. You gotta. Later, and just a few chapters later, Jesus would heal another man. This was a blind man. And you would think as he healed the blind man that his friends and his family and the people around him would be happy, but they weren't. He was no longer blind, and they're quizzing him, who did this? And you see, Jesus had healed him on a day when he wasn't supposed to. They called it the Sabbath day back then. You weren't supposed to heal people on that day. And so the religious leaders were getting upset at Jesus too. Well, not Jesus. They didn't know who healed him. And so they're quizzing this man. Who healed you? Who broke the rules? How come he broke the rules? Why? They weren't celebrating the healing. What's interesting is Jesus oftentimes broke the rules. Because Jesus always put life change before religious rules. Jesus always made people and not the rules the priority. And we have to remember that too, because it's real easy to embrace when we want to do our own life change, to just say, all I need to do is follow rules. I just need to follow the regulations and everything will work out. But it's not about rules and regulations. It's about being healed by Jesus. And so we have to realize that real growth isn't about following rules. It's about life change. Real growth isn't about following the rules. It's about life change. And I think it's so cool how this man answered all the questions they were asking him. Who did this, and why did they break the rules? Why did he do it on the Sabbath? I love the way he answered them. In John chapter 9, verse 25, he replied, whether he is a sinner or not, he's referring to Jesus, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. How awesome a testimony is that? I don't know how he does it. I'm not even sure exactly who he is. But this much I know, I once was blind, but now I see. What an amazing testimony that is. And that's our testimony too. And notice, he didn't take any special classes on how to share his testimony, and he didn't read a book on evangelism. He went out there not knowing much and just saying, the only thing I can tell you is I once was blind, but now I see. That's our testimony too. We go out there and we say, listen, I don't know exactly how he does it. I can't always explain it, but when you get that Jesus inside of you, he can take the broken pieces of your life and put them back together in a way I never could. You got to get Jesus in you. And we can't explain everything. It's faith. But when you get Jesus inside of you, and when you embrace this life he's calling you to, man, he can change you. But today we have to resolve the question, are we going to grow? Are you going to grow? And I'll tell you why we're engaging that question and why it can be difficult sometimes. Because if you decide, yes, I'm going to grow, yes, I want to start doing the things and following Jesus and take the steps that are necessary to grow, there's a process you have to go through that you need to be aware of every single time. And what that process looks like is this. When you change, you will face conflict. There's a graphic up there I need you to put up there. If you don't have it, okay. There's a graphic you have with circles in there. And it's a 3-step process you will walk through every single time if you wish to change. The minute you make a decision to change, which is your first step, the second step is this. You will face conflict. And then the third step is you will grow. It's change. It's conflict. It's grow. And this is the problem that we face. See, when you make that decision and you say, I want to change, I want to raise the bar, I want to turn a corner, I want to live a new life, I don't want to keep going back to those old wells of death and despair, I want to live the life Jesus called me to live, I'm going to change. But what immediately happens is you will face conflict, because now you have come in force against your status quo. You have come against the old life. You are coming against the old ways that used to do things. This is the biggest problem new Christians often walk into as well too, is they decide, I want to be a Christian, I want to follow Jesus, and they begin to realize, I can't live the way I used to live. There was full of destruction, it was full of bad habits, it was full of addictive behavior. I can't live that way anymore. And so as they begin to engage that life, they realize, I can't go to some of these places I used to go, and you know what? I can't always hang out with some of these friends that I used to hang out, because they're just going to try to pull me back into that old lifestyle and those old ways. And we may even face family who doesn't fully understand this decision you've made and why you've made it and why you're not hanging out as much as you used to and doing the things you used to. And we immediately face conflict. And the unfortunate part is this is where many Christians, new Christians in particular, sometimes jump ship. They don't understand why their friends are leaving them. They don't understand why people don't want to live the way they live. Or they come to grips with the reality, I just can't. Sometimes when you make a decision to change, it may mean you need new friends. It may mean that you can't go to the places you used to go to. You've got to embrace the conflict, because it is only in working through the conflict that you will experience growth. You see, it's one thing to say, I want to change. It's another thing altogether to embrace growth. But the pathway to growth is always through conflict. And maybe it's not as serious as the new Christian thing. Even in my own life, as the doctor said, hey, Jason, unless you want to be on medication for the next few years, you've got to change. I realized, well, I'm going to have to start exercising. I'm going to have to start running again. And maybe you get off to a good start, but don't you know, those of you who have run or exercised before, you can come up with a lot of really good excuses why not to get out of bed the next one, right? I mean, it's too cold, or I hurt too much, or I'm just tired. There's all kinds of excuses. But you know what I had to learn? If I'm really going to embrace this life change, if I'm really going to live this new life, I couldn't have the excuses. I was going to have to get out of bed even when I didn't want to get out of bed. I was going to have to leave work and go to the gym, whether I wanted to go to the gym or not. And that's just one of many examples. You have your own in life. But when we decide to change, you will face conflict. And the Bible is less interested in us avoiding conflict, and it's much more interested in how we engage conflict. Because it is in the conflict that we grow. It is in the conflict that we gain understanding, that we appreciate what we're walking through. And just as many of us have to walk through this question of, do I want to grow? I'm going to change directions just slightly for a minute here. Churches have to ask this question too. Churches have to ask this question as well. Do we want to grow? And this is both spiritually and it's numerically as well too, because remember, anything that stops growing, what? True for churches too. Do we want to grow? Now, many of us in this room would say, of course. But guess what's next? You see, it's easy to say yes to that question. But now we're going to face conflict. You see, because if you're going to grow, if you're going to engage change, if you're going to get better, even as a church, well, you're going to have to do some things a little bit differently. You can't do the same things the same old way and expect different results. You're going to have to change some things. You're going to have to experiment. You're going to have to innovate. You're going to have to adjust some things. And guess what? While we said yes, now you're messing in my business. Yeah, I think we should grow as long as it doesn't affect me. But it doesn't happen that way. Change, conflict, grow. Change, conflict, grow. We have to engage it. Which means we have to be willing to allow things to change. We have to be willing to try new things. I love this quote from a pastor. His name's Shannon Odell. He's a pastor that decided his church needed to grow in rural Arkansas. What's interesting is he pastors a 3,000-person church in a 1,200-person town. Because that church decided we're going to grow. People need to know Jesus. We're going to not just be this town, we're going to reach out to all the towns around us and be a light into the darkness. But he had this great thing to say in a book I was reading, interestingly, about a week or two ago. He said, I learned that people say they want to reach the lost until we start changing things they are familiar and comfortable with in order to do what it takes to really reach the lost. The reality is if you're going to grow in your life, you're going to have to engage conflict. The truth is, as a church, if we're truly going to grow, and we are, we too are going to have to engage in some conflict as well too. We're going to have to try new things. We're going to have to build bridges with the culture. We can't just keep doing the same things over and over again. And it's not about our comfort. It's not. It's not about our preferences. It's about reaching people who are far from God and introducing them to Jesus. More than 80% of our culture does not have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Oh, it's one thing to say I'm a Christian, but don't you know it's a whole other thing to have a relationship with Jesus? And these people need that Jesus inside them, changing them and making them more and more into his image. But sometimes when we engage the mess, it's going to be inconvenient. It's not always going to be in our timing. It might even be uncomfortable. But I believe it's what we're called to. Last week we drew a line in the sand and said, God's calling us forward with a vision statement as well. And that vision statement is this: we exist to introduce people to Jesus, whatever it takes and wherever God sends us. We exist to introduce people to Jesus, whatever it takes and wherever God sends us. But it's going to ask this question, if we agree to that. Are we willing to engage the tension and the conflict that will come with what we need to do to reach as many people as possible and introduce them to Jesus? Do we want to grow? Because just as it's true in your life and it's true here in church, the only way I know how to grow is to make a decision and change, to walk through the conflict that is necessary to change. And it's only on the other side of that growth happens. It's true in your business as well too. It's true in life. You change, conflict, grow. Change, conflict, grow. Are we going to be the sort of church that is okay engaging and living in the tension and the conflict, not only in our personal lives, but as a church as well?